Hello and welcome to this issue's technique section, which we're going to be looking at the fun side for many people when the trail gets steeper. There are many scenarios and many ways in which a trail can get steep. You can have a long descent, such as the one behind me, where speed control and various aspects of the physical elements are going to play a part. Much shorter, sharper steeps, banks, roll-ins, drop-offs if you'll call them that, bomb holes, all are going to rely on good adaptation of our core skills and good application of those skills. So let's go and find a variety of drops and see what's what. Starting nice and basic, and something that perhaps might not look much to many riders out there, many of you reading the mag. Indeed, once you've ridden it a couple of times, you'll probably feel that whatever your level of riding. As you're approaching, however, the main factor is the fact that the trail disappears out of sight in front of you. So as you're approaching, there's a horizon point beyond which you can't see the trail. And that for many can start to trigger some negative emotions and some negative physical outcomes attached to those. When it comes to riding steeper sections, many of the physical elements are going to be employed. We're already using them in our day-to-day, everyday riding for different scenarios. It's just how we apply them. Particularly important when we start to get steeper, we need to be thinking about speed control, footwork, entry section and exit, and the all-important psychological tier: confidence, commitment, control and concentration. We'll also need to refer back to one of the underpinning themes we've looked at in many editions, which is that of under-rotation, how we actually interact with the bike, how our mass engages with the bike, sending energy pushing down and through the bike rather than the bike sending us up and over. Perhaps the biggest single fear and consideration and worry for riders is that short, sharp trip over the bars. We can actually negate the chance of that happening dramatically by getting some core principles set up and applying some core thinking. So when we're riding the flat, with our weight through our cranks, in our ready position, with our hips positioned slightly behind our heels, shoulders in slightly above our feet, our mass is centered through the bike. As the gradients change, we want to keep that relationship the same, so that our weight continues to be centered through the bike. If the bike pitches forward and we pitch with it, there comes a point where any checking of the front wheel or any random braking through, a bit of comfort braking or a panic braking, quickly sends my mass over the pivot point of the front wheel. That is not a very good outcome at all, and we can only deal with that and stop that from happening by successfully positioning our body correctly. Now don't get me wrong, that doesn't mean riding around hanging off the back of the bike with your arse as far back as it will go. It's much more about the ability of the bike to rotate without rotating you. And the only way that can happen is if the saddle can pass between your legs. So there is some shifting of weight rearwards, but we're not talking about extending as far back as possible. We're just talking about clearing the saddle and allowing the bike to pitch without pitching us forwards. The amount we shift our weight, the amount we use our brakes, the amount we have to counter the momentum of our body as the bike slows down and our body's still falling, all depends on the size of the drop, the speed we're taking it at, and how much speed control we're applying. If we're letting rip down a short steep, there's not much need to move your mass back too far back at all, and all your consideration is where you're going next all the time. You're going to be building up speed, and you need to be thinking way ahead of the bike. If we're taking things more slowly and we're slowing the bike through the section, we've got to consider what's happening to our body mass and whether momentum and gravity is pushing us forward onto the bike, potentially to that pivot point, and we need to deal with that as well. So as approach, as usual, I'm looking through the section. As I rise up and the ground drops away, I'm shifting behind the bike and centering up as it levels off. Now in that instance, I'm riding it fairly slowly. I'm not allowing the gradient to accelerate the bike to its full potential. I am using some speed control. I'm not slowing the bike down necessarily so much as slowing its rate of acceleration. It is far easier to stop a bike getting too fast than it is to deal with the outcomes of the bike travelling too fast, which would often result in a mad panic brake where we shut down all our learned responses and we go to gut instinct, which is first and foremost to grab a handful of lever. Once those wheels stop turning and start skidding, we haven't got much control. So considered braking, squeezing, not grabbing, and just as with the braking techniques of before, we're under rotating to make sure that we're pushing through the bike rather than our body mass accelerating over the front of the bike. As I come over the lip there, the bike inverts the saddle pops between my legs. I'm not going way back, just enough to clear the saddle to allow the bike to rotate forwards, and as the bike levels off, I'm centering back up. The big danger of hanging too far off the back of the bike as you come through this section, particularly if you're doing it with speed, is if my mass is right back here. As I get to the bottom and it levels off, we can start to get to a loop out situation, landing on our coccyx and experiencing a level of pain probably not ideal. From a rider's eye perspective, as we're approaching the lump, we know there's a drop the other side, but we can't really tell whether that's a sheer drop the other side that's going to have to be popped off, jumped, or it's whether it's rollable. There's a fine line between the two, and in fact you can roll down something that's fairly near vertical at the top or vertical at the top, as long as the transition at the bottom isn't a right angle that's going to drive your front wheel into the ground. First time you ride this, you're not going to know that, so some caution, just so that as you're getting to a point of being able to control the speed over the top, if necessary, stop if you're not prepared in time. First time into there, if you just fly into it with no knowledge of what's the other side, you may get an unhappy surprise. From a psychological perspective though, thinking ahead of the bike, that concentration ladder, staying 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 steps ahead of the bike, really crucial. I can't leave all my thinking till I'm at the lip, so some considered control in terms of speed on the approach would be a good idea, particularly first time round. So as I ride up, I might use a little bit of speed control, shift my weight, centre up, and on we go. Okay, so that steep section is only short and not overly steep, but still we need to think about some core physical elements there. Primary, footwork. With our cranks level, we're not likely to snag a pedal as the front wheel drops off the lip and band the ground, which can stall the bike rather significantly, sending us flying. Secondly, is dropping that heel in, heel drop. People are starting to recognise the advantage of heel drop finally, which is good to know, but I want the bike to be pushing into the bike. If I'm too up on my toes as I go over anything, I'm always going to be subject to over rotation. That heel drop means that my mass pushes into the bike, so as my momentum pushes my mass forward on the bike rather than up and over, I'm down and into, propelling the bike through the section, negating any stalling of the front wheel and making sure that the bike stays slightly in front of me and I stay slightly on top of it. The steeper the terrain, the more we're going to have to drop our heel to maintain that push through. And you'll see on the very steep stuff, we're just literally trying to keep our foot at the same position as the bike pivots forward. In reality, that means our heel is dropping further and further as the bike does forwards. We go backwards and downwards with the heel. Secondly is our body position, and particularly our engagement with the hands, and that's our wrist drop. Riding around with your elbows forward over that lip, when that front wheel engages in the transition at the bottom, there's a stalling process and forward we go. I can still keep my weight forward if I want to pump through the transition at the bottom, and as a good rider you probably want to get some speed out of that transition by pumping it. Importantly, I need to push down and through, not up and over. So that wrist drop enables me to get my weight forward but still push through the bike when necessary. Rolling it a bit faster and actually doing a bit of speed control before the section, nothing in it. There's still a pop behind the saddle, but it's quicker and the movement is far more fluid. And there's not much time hanging around behind the saddle, it's just literally to allow that bike to pop over into the inverted position without sending me tumbling forwards before centering up, carrying on down the trail. That's a short, not particularly too steep. Penalty for failure is not too high. Biggest mistake you can make perhaps there is lack of commitment. If you get to the edge, the front wheel's pitching in, you change your mind. Once the bike's at this position and you've changed your mind and start grabbing brakes, very quickly you're going to end up rotating forward, overtaking the bike and landing at the bottom in a little bit of a pile. So let's look at something a little bit longer, steeper, and move on.